All right. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under
The
will.
law, love under will.
Welcome. My name is Nick Latursky, Fratrem Torquatus, and this is Magick and the Mormon Church. I'm going to cover some early history, and there'll be a good deal of information here. By all means, please ask questions if you have them as we go through. In some cases, I'm going to show documents and things on the screen. Please don't feel obligated to read through them all because there's a lot of material. Sometimes it's just show and tell, but you'll be able to take more time to read those when this comes out on video later. So, as usual, we welcome you to Sekhet-Maat. We're pleased you chose to join us today for this free class. If you are not a dues-paying member of Sekhet-Maat, we do appreciate any voluntary donations that can help us continue our mission of offering these events in the future. If so, you can click on the link in the chat section or visit our website at pdxoto.org. And we thank you for your support. So, full disclosure, I am a former member of the Mormon Church by choice and for reasons. One of those reasons would be my husband. This means that I have biases. So do many Mormon apologists who have absolutely zero knowledge of magical practices, but who spend huge amounts of time trying to convince people that what I'm about to show you is not real. Fun fact, some of those Mormon apologists are actually still good friends of mine, and I still admire many things about Mormonism and Joseph Smith, so go figure. So Aleister Crowley actually had some things to say about Joseph Smith. This is the more famous statement he made. History affords innumerable examples of the lofty intelligences and noblest characters shooting up from the grossest stock. And he lists several people, among whom he names Joseph Smith. And innumerable other men of the highest genius came from peasant parentage. So what about that peasant parentage? Well, this is his mother, Lucy Mack Smith. Lucy wrote a memoir of the family and made an interesting statement in the course of it. As she's writing about the family settling their farm in New York, she makes the statement, "I shall change my theme for the present, but let not my reader suppose that because I shall pursue another topic for a season, that we've stopped our labor and went at trying to win the faculty of Abrac, drawing magic circles or soothsaying to the neglect of all kinds of business. We never during our lives suffered one important interest to swallow up every other obligation, but whilst we worked with our hands, we endeavored to remember the service and the welfare of our souls." So this statement is very telling. She mentions the faculty of Abrac, which at the time showed up in a lot of Masonic documents. The faculty of Abrac really is a Kabbalistic concept, works with gematria and working with various Hebrew letters, sorting out the names of God. There's a famous Masonic document that responds to the idea that Masons worked the faculty of Abrac and tries to say, oh no, this was a silly charm to try to heal the sick. But it's funny that Lucy mentions this sort of out of the blue and mentions magic circles and soothsaying. But notice that she says, we never let one important interest swallow up all of our time. So she certainly isn't denying that they did these things. But she tries to say, oh, but we didn't just do that. We also worked hard. Joseph's father, on the other hand, the family started out in Vermont. And by the time the family had moved into New York, and then after Joseph Smith started his church, they had moved to Ohio at one point. Joseph Smith Sr., the father, was in council with some other man, and he's told them, he says, "I know more about money digging than any man in this generation, for I have been in the business more than 30 years. This is what he said. Many people have said, and this happened in New York, where the money digging business was carried on to a great extent by the Smith family. So this puts Joseph Smith Sr. in the practice of money digging prior to the time that Joseph Smith Jr. was born. And by money digging, at this point, we mean magical practice of treasure seeking. Later on, when Joseph Smith Jr. was trying to get support for his run for president of the United States, he sent an appeal to patriots in Vermont, including from the area of Vermont where he had been born. And a group of them, referring to themselves as Green Mountain Boys, wrote a rather nasty letter back. And in part of that, they said, "You was old enough when you left here to remember a great many things about him," meaning your father, "and how he used to tell about you being born with a veil over your face, and that he intended to procure a stone for you to see all over the world with." So at this time, there was folklore that if a child was born with a caul over their face, which is part of the amniotic sac, that was a sign that that child would have prophetic gifts. So Joseph Sr., in seeing that his child was born with a piece of the amniotic sac over his face, ran around town telling everybody, "My son is going to be a prophet, and we're going to get a stone for him that he'll be able to look into and see anything he wants to anywhere around the world." Well, sure enough, the family moves to New York, and in 1822, Joseph Smith and his older brother Alvin are helping to dig a well for a family by the name of Chase. And the well is about 20 or 30 feet down into the ground. And Willard Chase comes across this really odd looking rock. And the rock stands out because it just doesn't look like other rocks in the area. So they're all sort of staring at this rock. And Joseph takes an interest in it, and he picks up that rock from Willard. He sticks it in his hat, and he covers his face with the hat and the rock side, and he stares at it for a while. Doesn't say much about it at the time, and he gives the rock back. Well, the next morning comes knocking on Willard Chase's door and asks for the stone because he can see things in it. And Willard Chase says, "Well, I want to keep it because it's a curiosity, but I'll let you borrow it." Well, Joseph borrows it and doesn't return it for 2 years. Then he does return it, then he borrows it again, and then after that, despite how many times Willard Chase tries to get it back, the Smith family won't return it, because this becomes the seer stone that Joseph Smith will use throughout the rest of his life. So as Joseph Smith was becoming known and beginning to start his church later, affidavits were gathered from people in Palmyra, New York, where they had lived. And these affidavits talked about what the family was up to, what their reputation was. And William Stafford, in particular, talked in some detail about what the family was doing. So a great part of their time was devoted to digging for money, especially in the nighttime when they said the money could be most easily obtained. Joseph Jr. could see by placing a stone of singular appearance in his hat in such a manner as to exclude all light, at which time they pretended he could see all things within and under the earth. At certain times, these treasures could be obtained very easily. At others, the obtaining of them was difficult. The facility of approaching them depended on a great measure in the state of the moon. New moon and Good Friday, I believe, were regarded as the most favorable times for obtaining these treasures. Joseph Sr. first made a circle 12 or 14 feet in diameter. This circle, said he, contains the treasure. He then stuck in the ground a row of witch hazel sticks around the said circle for the purpose of keeping off the evil spirits. Within this circle, he made another of about 8 or 10 feet in diameter. He walked around 3 times on the periphery of the last circle, muttering to himself something which I could not understand. He next stuck a steel rod in the center of the circles and then enjoined profound silence upon us, lest we should arouse the evil spirit who had charge of these treasures. After we dug a trench about 5 feet in depth around the rod, the old man, by signs and motion, asked leave of absence, and he went to the house to inquire of young Joseph, the cause of our disappointment. He soon returned and said that Joseph had remained all this time in the house, looking in his stone and watching the motions of the evil spirit, that he saw the spirit come up to the ring, and as soon as it beheld the cone which we had formed around the rod, it caused the money to sink. We then went into the house, and the old man observed that we had made a mistake in the commencement of the operation. If it had not been for that, said he, we would have got the money. So this is more detailed than most of the affidavits, but this is really typical of what people said the Smith family were up to. They were digging on their own farm. They were digging on nearby farms. This was their common practice. And they weren't the only ones in the area doing it. Also around that time, in 1822, Palmyra was on the Erie Canal, and the canal was newly opened, and it made this little town more of a center of activity. First of all, people had been living there and working on digging the canal, but then with the canal there and goods and services coming through, there was more population, there was more activity, there were more availability of goods. And so businesses opened up, and one of these was the Bookstore of Ef Marshall. And Ef Marshall ran this ad in the newspaper for several issues. And it's sort of interesting when you look at what he advertised, because a lot of Mormon historians and apologists really want to pretend that this was the frontier, that Joseph was uneducated and living out in the sticks where nobody knew anything. That these people were backwoods hicks and unsophisticated types. But I want to just kind of point out a few things here. Greek and Latin dictionaries, astronomical books, hieroglyphical books. This is just at the time the Rosetta Stone is being translated. Gilt paper, parchment. And these are among the things that are being sold by the new bookstore in town. And these all come into play because of what Joseph's going to be up to. So some of the books that become available in the area. One of these is the Magus. Some of you may be familiar with it. I know at least some of you are, because we've talked about it. The Magus was one of the most popular magic books of the time. It was published in 1801, and really was sort of the go-to manual. This was for making talismans. This was for basic astrological information. This was for contacting spirits. And as we're going to see as we go through, this is one of the sources that the Smith family used for a number of their activities. Another book that was very popular at the time was this one by Ebenezer Sidley. Ebenezer Sidley wrote a number of books at the time, but this was kind of the go-to. A new and complete illustration of the celestial science of astrology. Title goes on and on and on, as titles did at that time. This book is, a good 3 or 4 inches thick, has all kinds of astrological charts in it, talks about casting astrological charts. Then it also, again, goes into talismans, goes into spirit invocations, goes into a number of things, including treasure digging and how to find lost items, lost treasures. This book by Reginald Scott, The Discovery of Witchcraft. This one is sort of interesting because the intent of this book was to expose, just like I said, to expose witchcraft. And it's written in such a way that it's from a Christian perspective, and it ridicules and condemns magical practice. But it does so in such a way that it gives a detailed record. It's a very detailed how-to book. And so I don't know how much it was used by Christians to hunt down, sinful witchcraft, but it became a resource for magicians. It contains a good deal of the same material as Sidley. There was some borrowing back and forth between them. But again, it's one that was easily obtainable in the area. So, these three titles are the most common that were available to the Smith family at that time. So, to this day, these artifacts remain from the Smith family. At the bottom is a knife that belonged to the Smith family. There are no very high quality photographs, unfortunately, that have been published. But what you can see, it's a little sort of triangular, almost arrow pointed engraving on there. That is a sigil of Mars. And Mars was the ruling planet of Joseph Smith Sr., the father of the prophet Joseph Smith. So in all likelihood, this knife actually belonged to Joseph Sr. Likely was used in the tracing of magic circles.
That's a black hilted knife too, I believe, so that is used for calling infernal spirits, not celestial spirits, just for point of reference.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I've just started. I know there's a black handle and a white handle. I didn't know the difference a whole lot between them. So thank you.
Yeah, the white one's just for everything else.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. On top here, there are 3 parchments that survive. And all these items have been passed down through descendants of the brother of Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith. And these survive till today. These 3 parchments, along with a leather pouch that they were folded up and tucked into, still remain in the family. And again, very hard to get photographs of. The one to the lowest one there is very faded. And so even when you can find a photograph, it's extremely difficult to make anything out of. So we're not going to really focus on that at all. The one to the right, I'm going to show you a better image of, and then we'll take a little better look at the one on the top. So this is that one on the right, and Mormon historians who have worked with these call this the St. Peter bind them parchment. So we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this one, but I just wanted to give you a chance to take a look at this. This is the front side of it. And this is the back side of it. And you see in the corners here, you have this charm essentially to bind one's enemies. The real masterpiece, however, is this. This has been referred to as the Holiness to the Lord parchment in the Smith family. And yeah, it's kind of glorious. It is on parchment. It is adorned with gold paint. And this is what we're going to dig into a little bit to understand what Joseph was actually up to. So on the parchment are two round seals. These are directly copied from Ebenezer Sidley's other book, The Clovis, or Key to Unlock the Mysteries of Magic of Rabbi Solomon. So you see there on the frontispiece, you have those same two seals. And it's interesting, these seals appear also in Reginald Scott's book, and also in other editions of the same book by Ebenezer Sidley. I'm an unapologetic book nerd, and much to my husband's amusement, I sat here poring over the differences between the editions, and this is the edition that was used, because there are all sorts of little differences in the copying. And this is definitely the nearest copy to the fine details of these seals.
I'm pretty sure those are geomantic symbols on the bottom, like at what, 7 o'clock or something. That looks like via to me, meaning busy, closed or something, like a market, right? Like, so I know in Key of Solomon that was part of the tradition, was to use geomantic symbols in the seals. So that's interesting to me as well.
Yeah. So in those descriptions, these are the explanations of the seals. The ones, whosoever beareth this sign, all spirits will do him homage. The other, whosoever beareth this sign need fear no foe. Another figure from that same frontispiece is referred to as the greatest character. Now, I showed you the St. Peter bind them parchment we didn't get into. On the lower right here, you see an exact, pretty much an exact copy of Sidley's diagram there. The Holiness to the Lord parchment has something very similar. If they were trying to copy it, they obviously made a mistake. There is no known exact duplicate from the sources that anybody's looked at, but it probably was at least inspired by Sidley's. Then we have this figure that appears on both of those parchments. This is actually an angelic sigil for an angel referred to as Polypa. One of the celestial powers, and this, by the way, is again from Ebenezer Sidley. One of the celestial powers whose peculiar office it is to guard and forewarn such as are virgins and uncontaminated youth against all the evils of debauchery and prostitution, to elevate the mind to a love of virtue, honor, and revealed religion. He personifies the character of an illustrious angel, of a bright but most complacent countenance, and is known by the following magical symbol, which is worn about the neck of virgins as a protection from all the assaults of evil demons, and it is said to be infallible against the powers of seduction. So what this does, aside from the fact that it tells us the purpose of it in the parchment, it also helps date the parchment, because Joseph Smith gets married in 1827, and we know that these materials were becoming available in 1822. So it helps narrow down the time frame of when this parchment was actually, or when this lamen was actually created. Again, another angelic sigil from the same section of the book. It shows up on both parchments. This one is Naga, devoted to the protection of those who are assaulted by evil spirits or witches, and whose minds are sunk by fearful and melancholy apprehensions of the assaults of the devil and the power of death. His proper office is to fortify the mind and to lead the senses to a contemplation of the attributes of God and the joys of heaven, the reward of all good works. His appearance is represented as perfectly celestial, having a crown of gold upon his head, with a shield and spear in his hands, for the protection of those over whom he presides. The following is his magical character, which is worn around the neck as a preservation against witchcraft and suicide. I should point out that the Smith family was known for melancholy, and what we would now call depression. Joseph Smith Sr. was an alcoholic. Joseph Smith's youngest son, David Hiram Smith, struggled with severe depression throughout his life, and was to the point of being institutionalized. So it's not shocking that an angel with this sort of attribute would be in the parchment. This figure at the center of the lamen comes directly from the Magus. And so the Magus is really a compilation of documents. And the particular item in the Magus that this pertains to is Francis Barrett's translation of the Magic and Philosophy of Trithemius of Spanheim, containing the secret things and doctrine of spirits and the art of drawing spirits into crystals. This document has special interest even now for many who are practicing based on this document. And when Francis Barrett put together the translation, he gave it its own frontispiece, and this Raphael Star happens to be part of that frontispiece. And that's what Joseph Smith put at the center of the lamen, with some additional Hebrew added. So as it gets explained by Francis earlier in the book, he talks about making lamens. He says, the invocation being made, the good angel will appear as such. So now the lamen which is used to invoke any good spirit must be made after the following manner: either in metal conformable or in new wax mixed with convenient spices and colors, or it may be made with pure white paper with convenient colors. And the outward form of it may be either square, circular, or triangular, or the like sort, according to the rule of the numbers, in which there must be written the divine names, as well as general as special. And in the center of the lamen, draw a hexagon or a character of 6 corners. This one happens to be 12, so it's the multiple of 6. In the middle thereof, write the name and character of the star or the spirit, his governor, to whom the good spirit that is called is subject. So in this case, Raphael. And about the character, let there be placed so many characters of 5 corners or pinnacles as the spirits we would call together at once. So if you're calling multiple spirits, you need to have as many 5-pointed stars as spirits you're going to call. But if we should call only one, nevertheless, there must be made 4 pentagons, wherein the name of the spirit or spirits with their characters are to be written. What's interesting is, even if you look at the example that Francis gave, he doesn't write any names in the pentagons, or pentagrams. They are blank, just like these are here. But again, the holiness of the Lord parchment is being made exactly according to the instructions in the Magus. And specifically for the purpose of invoking a spirit. So what's sort of fun about this Laman is nothing is accidental. Everything on it has a purpose. At first glance, it may look like there's a lot of decorative things going on, but the more you look at it, the more you realize that everything in it is symbolic. So as I went through this, I was able to identify every sign of the zodiac, as well as every planet. And just a fun fact, as I was doing this, after a while, I was like, okay, I can't find Neptune and Pluto. What's going on? And then I thought, oh, wait a minute. Siri, when was Neptune discovered? Siri, when was Pluto discovered? And sure enough, neither of them had been discovered in 1823 when this Laman was most likely made. So this Laman contains every planet that was then known, as well as all the zodiac signs. The zodiac signs are actually in their proper order as they move around clockwise. The choice of where Joseph placed this insignia of the planets is not clear. Josh and I actually played with that this morning, thinking, well, perhaps this is a natal chart. If it is, we don't know whose. We couldn't figure it out. I played with the birth dates for Joseph and his father and his brothers, all of whom were involved in the treasure digging. I played with some significant dates. I didn't come up with anything. It would be could be really interesting if there was a way to, reverse engineer from a natal chart to get to significant dates and see what we came up with, to see whether this actually depicts a particular natal chart. But in any event, it's still interesting to see that these are all represented in the Laman itself. This figure actually shows up, doesn't show up in the books that were common, that we know were commonly known around the area of the Smith family. What we do know is that it shows up in a couple British sources in the 15th and the 17th centuries. And here's an example of that. Oops, sorry. Now, one thing about this Laman, not everything is as precisely drawn, and not everything has the perfect artistry that the creator might have liked. For one thing, it's clear they didn't have as fine a brush for their gold paint as they might have liked. It's also true, as Josh and I were talking this morning, and Josh pointed out that this was likely made in the space of an hour, in a hurry, for magical reasons. But it's interesting that the Raphael Star in the center is framed by what on first glance looks like two squiggly marks. But if you take a closer look at them, they actually resemble at least an effort at the angelic sigils of Michael on the top there and Gabriel on the bottom. You can particularly see that on the bottom one with Gabriel. You can at least see on the left end of it, how you have that open box shape. Same with Michael, you can see where it at least comes around the star. So you can see how the effort was made to get the general shape in there. This is actually going to come up as an interest later on. Now, you pointed out that some Hebrew had been added to the star beyond just what was in the Magus. And I spent some time with a friend who has studied Hebrew and has a good working knowledge. And we were able to do some translating of that Hebrew in the center. And what we essentially come up with was sort of remarkable in itself. Starting at the top and working around clockwise, we get, "Behold, by Raphael at an ancient mountain, I speak to the Father Adonai." This becomes interesting because Joseph Smith, at the time that the family was living there in Palmyra, New York, was running around telling everybody that all of these big hills in the area were actually thrown up by ancient inhabitants burying their treasures. That none of these hills were natural. They were all man-made constructions. And so what this suggests is that, this Laman is actually constructed in connection with the idea of speaking with Raphael in these, ancient hills or mountains. It starts to tie this to the local place as well as the time. Okay,
so Nick, I'm sorry, can I ask a question really fast?
Sure, absolutely.
Just that, because this is fascinating, but I wanted to get and you probably already went over it, but a time frame again. Is this after his church has started? He's using talismanic magic, or is this quite a time before the church has started?
This is quite a time before. So
okay, so far it's not connected to the starting of a church yet. He's not using talismanic magic to start the church yet.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
He's going to start his church in 1830. Right now, we're still talking in 1822 to 1823. So thank you for asking. I appreciate it. Looks like there's some chat. Are there questions in the chat? Because if there are questions, I can't see them. I'm counting on somebody to let me know.
Not really. There was an observation that the signs around the Laman were in counterclockwise order.
Oh, okay.
And that we were discussing what the gematria of the Hebrew in the middle of the star there could be.
Yeah, I'll have to get that image from you so I can work out the gematria behind it, because I am curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. D. Michael Quinn, who's a Mormon, or a former Mormon historian, he was excommunicated for doing research like this. Tried to play with the gematria in an effort, because he found sources that he believed suggested that you were to encode your name as the creator of the Laman within that star. And so he thought that he could figure out who made the star by sorting that out. And honestly, he butchers it really badly. And he ends up, saying, well, it doesn't correspond with anybody in the Smith family, but it comes close to this other person, so maybe this is who they meant. He doesn't get anywhere with it. So I'd be interested to see if you come up with something more solid, because even his translation is pretty bad to begin with. He's getting letters wrong and such. So,
Yeah, I'd just be curious what, I don't really care where it points. I'm just curious what it points at. So
right. Yeah,
Interesting.
exactly. It'd be really interesting. So, why are we going on about this lawman? Well, just to kind of catch us up where we're at. Joseph Smith Jr. is born in 1805. His father's running around telling everybody, we're going to get him a stone that he can see anything, anywhere in the world. By 1820, Joseph has claimed that he's had a vision of God and Jesus, forgiving him of his sins and telling him that he's going to be a prophet. And by this time, the men of the family are all actively involved in treasure digging through magical practices. 2 years later, in 1822, Joseph basically commandeers a seer stone, and word begins spreading through the community of his gifts as a treasure seer. He's getting hired out by people to look for treasure. He also becomes acquainted with some experienced magicians who come in and out of the community for short periods of time. And as you look in the newspaper stories and such, these men are known to have grimoires. Also, the new bookstore in town starts advertising relevant books, parchment, gilt paper, and such. So 1823 rolls around, and the family's still actively involved in treasure digging. We get to Sunday, September 21st, 1823. And according to the history written as he told it to one of his close associates, all he desired was to be prepared in his heart to commune with some kind of messenger. He supposes it must have been 11 or 12 or perhaps later, as the noise and bustle of the family in retiring had long since ceased. So in fairness, let me tell you the official story. This is a reconstruction of the Smith cabin, and it's believed to be an accurate reconstruction. There's archaeological evidence as well as other evidence. They've done a very good job of rebuilding it. This is an artist's conception that's been around for a long time, very popular in the Mormon Church. The story, officially, is that between 1820 and 1823, Joseph had done, normal teenage things. And because God and Jesus had told him that he'd be a prophet, he felt guilty for his ordinary teenage mistakes. And so one evening after the family had been talking about the Bible and he'd gone to bed, he decided to pray to God for forgiveness of his sins and to know that he was still okay with God. And as he was praying, this enormously bright light appeared, and then an angel appears in the light and identifies himself as Moroni. Moroni tells him not only that he's in good standing with God, but also tells him that in a hill just about 2 miles away, there is an ancient record written on gold plates that he is to retrieve, that he will translate by the gift and power of God, that'll be a new witness to the world of Jesus Christ. Well, the angel appears, tells him all this, leaves. And then the angel comes back, repeats everything, plus a little more, and leaves. The angel comes back a third time, says everything again, and a little more, leaves, and then the rooster crows. So this has taken all night long. Depending on which source you read, there are differences in how the story is told. Either it was 3 actual visits, it could have been dreams. The story gets, in the earliest tellings, goes back and forth between whether it was an angel or a spirit. It goes back and forth a little bit whether the name of the visitor was Moroni or Nephi. who is the first, which is the name of the first prophet who wrote in the Book of Mormon. So there's some wiggle room about what's going on here. Now, for myself, especially when I visited the reconstructed cabin, it's not big. The parents most likely slept downstairs. The children, including Joseph, all slept upstairs in a very small upstairs space with a very pitched roof, far more pitched than this picture looks. And I always sort of thought, okay, all this activity is going on and his brothers and sisters sleep through it. Okay, well, maybe God just made it so that they slept through it. Fine, okay, that I can deal with that. Except people in the early 19th century didn't sleep the way that you and I do now. People in the early 19th century, not having the same habits and artificial lighting practices that we have and such, had a different pattern. They had what's called a biphasal sleeping pattern. So typically, people went to bed about 9 or 10 at night, slept until shortly after midnight, got up, took care of additional house chores and such, then went back to bed and slept until dawn. So for the story to be the way that Joseph told it, that means that he started this after everybody went to bed, but everybody got up in the middle of it. So that doesn't quite work out the way that he said it. So one possibility is he made the whole thing up. And that's what I thought for a long time. One possibility is that everybody in the family knew that he was going to do this and stayed out of the upstairs. Okay. One possibility is he wasn't even in the house. So the hill that we're talking about actually had been long designated as the place in which countless treasures were buried. Joseph the elder had spaded up many a foot of the hillside to find them, and Joseph Jr. had on more than one occasion accompanied him. This was not quite the out-of-the-blue experience that the official story makes it out to be. Well, Joseph said that he was praying for this manifestation or visitation, saying he had full confidence he would receive one since he'd already experienced one. What's interesting is he decided to do this on the night of September 21st, 1832. So he chose the planetary hour of the moon, which would have run into Monday, September 22nd, 1832, which is the day of the autumnal equinox. This was also the first night after the peak of the full moon. Well, Reginald Scott, in The Discovery of Witchcraft, says in the composition of any circle for magical feats, the fittest time is the brightest moonlight, or when the storms of lightning, winds, or thunder are raging through the earth, and can more easily hear the invocations of the exorcist. So an interesting little blurb was published just a couple years later, actually, but it refers back to the same time period. And this is somebody else's account, just to give you an idea of what's culturally going on around Joseph. And this is from 3 other men who also tried to invoke a spirit on September 22nd, a year before. On the night of September 22nd, 1822, we resolved upon invocating the spirits of the moon, and accordingly having prepared the circle and used the necessary ceremonies and incantations, there suddenly came such a furious storm of rain and hail, and such a dreadful tempest arose, with such fearful, dreadful blasts of winds that the elements seemed as if waging war with each other. We every moment expected the dome skylight over our heads to be shattered into 1,000 pieces. The rain continued to fall in gushing torrents, the wind howled mournfully, and the lightning flashed in our faces, while the thunder actually shook the building to its foundations. Expecting these occurrences, we were nothing dismayed thereat, but persisted, notwithstanding the fury of the elements, to urge the spirits more powerfully to visible appearance. What followed we cannot at present reveal. Suffice that we had ample proof of the reality of spiritual agency. And they go on that, as they dismissed the spirits, it got even worse. And, funny thing, nobody else in the neighborhood had heard anything. So this idea of invoking spirits on the autumnal equinox was not new. It was something known in the culture. Jeffrey, do you have a question? Okay.
Just to clarify on that previous slide, that should be 1823, not 32.
Oh, thank you very much. That is the correction that needs to be made. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, in both cases, gosh.
Dyslexia will get you.
Yeah. The original Scott also writes of an invocation of 3 spirits, that it should begin at 11 o'clock at night under a waxing moon while Mercury reigns, bearing the 2 seals of earth that we already saw, or he says should be on parchment. And these are the 2 large seals that we already saw in Joseph's Lawman. And as Reginald Scott talks about this other invocation, he says, but if he desires it, they, meaning these 3 spirits, will engage to bring him the most precious of their jewels and riches in 24 hours, discovering also unto him the way of finding hidden treasures and the richest mines. So remember I pointed out to these angelic sigils? Well, it just so happens that the time that Joseph chose to invoke a spirit was specifically at a time when he started on a Sunday, which was the day of the sun when Michael ruled, but during the hour of the moon when Gabriel ruled. So this actually shows some advanced planning going on. This lawman was made to be used at a specific time. So going back to Trithemius and this whole idea of drawing spirits into crystal and such. When one, and Trithemius, of course, has a very elaborate system of equipment, if you will. But even now, magicians simplify that. 2 of the key pieces of that, however, are the lawman and the scrying device, whatever scrying device one may be able to use. But the structure that Trithemius uses, as far as the practice, is as follows. In what time thou wouldst deal with the spirits by the table and crystal, thou must observe the planetary hour and whatever planet rules in that hour. Then there's the consecration of the actual scrying device. O God, who art the author of all good things, strengthen, I beseech thee, thy poor servant, that he may stand fast without fear through this dealing and work. Enlighten, I beseech thee, O Lord, the dark understanding of thy creature, so that his spiritual eye may be open to see and know thy angelic spirits descending here in this crystal. And thou, O inanimate creature of God, be sanctified and consecrated, and blessed to this purpose, that no evil fantasy may appear in thee. Or if they do gain ingress into this creature, they may be constrained to speak intelligibly and truly, without the least ambiguity, for Christ's sake. Amen. Then taking your ring and pentacle, put the ring on the little finger of your right hand. Hang the pentacle around the neck. You notice the pentacle can be wrote on clean virgin parchment or engraven on a square plate of silver, suspended from the neck to the breast. So then he says, take your black ebony wand to trace your circle. And then the actual invocation. In the name of the blessed and holy Trinity, I desire thee, thou strong, mighty angel, whichever angel is being invoked, here be Raphael, that if it be the divine will of him who is called Tetragrammaton, the holy God, the Father, that thou take upon thee some shape as best become thy celestial nature, and appear to us visibly here in this crystal, and answer our demands in as far as we shall not transgress the bounds of the divine mercy and goodness by requesting unlawful knowledge, but that thou wilt graciously show us what things are most profitable for us to know and do, to the glory and honor of his divine majesty who liveth and reigneth world without end. And then there are additional prayers to God then to confirm that ability for the Spirit to appear and to thank God for that appearance. So this is what Joseph was up to. Goes on, and others explain that Joseph said he had a revelation from God that told him they were hid, that the plates of gold were hid in a certain hill, and he looked in his stone and saw that in the place of the deposit. Told another he was the discoverer of a magic stone which he used to carry around in his hat. His story was that by the aid of his wonderful stone he found gold plates on which were inscribed the writings and hieroglyphics. So when Joseph went to the hill on September 22nd, 1823, he was able to open up the spot where the plates were, and his family was struggling financially. They were heading toward losing the farm. And his first thought was, this is a lot of gold. And so he'd been warned, he says, by Moroni, not to allow any thoughts of profit. And so because of that, he was not allowed to take the plates at the time. Instead, Moroni told him to come back exactly 1 year later and to bring his older brother, Alvin. Alvin was very much the favorite son. Alvin, because of their father's alcoholism and such, was almost the surrogate head of the family. Unfortunately, Alvin inconveniently died 2 months later by poisoning from a quack doctor. Well, wouldn't you know it, just as Ebenezer Sidley and also Reginald Scott talk about spirit invocation and these tools and such, the very next thing in their books are discourses on how to raise the dead. So, they had these resources in the same books that they're using to get their information on how to do the treasure seeking. And a funny thing happens. Everybody in town seems to know that the Smith family tried to dig up Alvin Smith's body so that when Joseph came back a year later, he could bring Alvin, like the angel told him to. And, they promptly need to get rid of that rumor, whether it happened or not. So within 3 days, Joseph Sr. places an article in the local newspaper to the public denouncing this rumor and going on and on about how on earth could people possibly think that the family would dig up their dear son they lost and have him dissected and such. Of course, there's no mention here of magic. They make it about dissection, but how deeply wounding this rumor is and such. But the timing and all and such, it is clearly about the idea that they could have been trying to resurrect Alvin to bring him to the hill. It didn't work that way. So Joseph gets there without Alvin. He tries to take the plates out of their hiding spot. But again, he doesn't follow directions. He sets them down beside him, and he turns back to the hole where they were buried, thinking, well, maybe there's something else of value there that I can get for my family. And there isn't. He turns back, and the plates are gone. And the angel says, hey, you're still not getting the point here. So he's told, come back next year, bring the right person with you. The next 2 years he comes, and the records, the historical record isn't very clear about those next 2 years. The only thing we do know is that on one of those 2 years, he tries bringing Samuel Lawrence, a local necromancer. You remember I said that there were a couple itinerant magicians that came through the area? One of those was Samuel Lawrence. Samuel Lawrence, interestingly enough, sort of coaches Joseph and keeps telling him, well, look in your stone again. Do you see anything else there hidden in the hill? Do you see any interpreting objects? Do you see any additional breastplates, anything like this? Funny thing is, those become part of the story later on as far as what's buried with the plates. Well, finally, Joseph, on one of these occasions, Moroni, comes clean with Joseph and tells him, well, the right person is going to be your wife. And you're going to know this woman when you see her, and she'll know you. Joseph's still hiring out as a treasure seer. And a man by the name of Josiah Stoll comes up from Pennsylvania because he's heard Joseph's reputation clear from there. And he hires Joseph to come help on a dig. And while he's down there, he meets Emma Hale and decides she's the one. Her father wants nothing to do with Joseph. He thinks that Joseph's disreputable, which is really strange because Isaac Hale was in on the investment for the dig to begin with. But he refuses to give permission for Joseph to marry Emma, so they elope. And finally, on the 22nd of September, 1827, we have this really interesting incident where they go in the middle of the night. And as it happens, the story that, again, has been told, a spirit had appeared to Joseph in a vision and informed him on the 22nd of September, he must repair to the place where was deposited this manuscript, dressed in black clothes and riding a black horse with a switched tail, and demand the book in a certain name. And after obtaining it, he must go directly away and neither lay it down nor look behind him. And that's essentially what did happen. He dressed in black. He went to the hill, left Emma at the bottom of the hill with the wagon. Excuse me. While he went up on the hill, apparently for a couple hours, and finally came down with the plates, and they took off and hid them in the woods and made it back to their family house by morning. So for many years, the story was that Joseph used a golden breastplate like that of the high priest in the Bible and a pair of basically spectacles made of sacred stones that were buried with the plates to translate the Book of Mormon. Even faithful Mormon historians no longer make that claim. They claim that those things were buried with the plates, but they no longer claim that those were used, except for perhaps at the very beginning of the translation. The idea being that very quickly, Joseph gave those up in preference for his own seer stone. So this artist, Adam Worthington, gave me permission to use his image. And this, frankly, is a much more accurate image of Joseph Smith as translator, with his lamen and his seer stone, which he would place in the hat and then bury his face into the hat in the darkness. The story that he gave to those who assisted in writing down the translation is that he would, there in the darkness, begin to focus, and he would see a light and would begin to actually see words appear. Ultimately, this becomes the Book of Mormon. And Moroni, being the deceased spirit of the last prophet that had written in the Book of Mormon. In treasure lore of the time and in these same books, there is the ongoing idea of a treasure spirit as the owner of a treasure who had been murdered, being bound to then haunt, if you will, the treasure and guard it. And so one who is seeking that treasure has to appease the spirit, has to invoke the spirit and cajole the spirit and obtain the treasure. So Moroni, in the Book of Mormon, as it comes to an end, talks about the fact that he is now going to hide the place, that he's alone, that everybody with him has been killed, and that he supposes that he will soon be killed. And so now he's going to seal up the record. So you actually have, again, going back to the treasure lore, this idea that Moroni is exactly that. The owner of the treasure, perhaps killed, and bound to guard it until Joseph himself does invoke him and win over the treasure. This does not end Magick and Mormonism. Many faithful Mormon historians who are willing to admit all this back history will say, oh, this was God's way of training Joseph to be a prophet. And once the church was established, he put all this behind him. And that's really not accurate. In the 1840s, for example, Joseph Smith built a temple at Nauvoo, Illinois. That original temple was destroyed. This is a photo of a reconstruction that I personally helped with the construction of. And it's kind of near and dear to me, honestly. The top row of windows here, there's an inset photograph. Just to give you an idea that, these sort of magical symbols still remain within Mormonism. Even though many Mormons today have no idea of their origins or their meaning or their importance, they still persist. Joseph himself was killed in 1844. And at the time of his death, he had on his person this talisman. Photograph on the left is both sides of a Jupiter talisman that was in his possession. And along with his other personal effects, it was returned to his wife, Emma. She passed it down to her stepson, Charles Bideman. And Charles eventually gave it to Wilford Wood, or sold it, I should say, to Wilford Wood, who was a Mormon collector of artifacts. Emma referred to it as Joseph's Masonic piece, without knowing a whole lot about it, other than it was very precious to Joseph and that he carried it with him at all times. On the right is a diagram from the Magus. And what's sort of interesting, if you look, and I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly, I forgive it, the squiggly long line there at the very bottom is a sigil of the intelligence of Jehophaphael. And you'll notice there's a break in the line. You can see that really clearly in the diagram from the Magus. That's not supposed to have a break in the line. Every other published illustration shows that to be a continual line. That's a printing error in the Magus. The fact that the line has a break there in Joseph Smith's talisman is actually evidence that it was drawn directly from the Magus, as was a good deal of the earlier things we talked about. So these are influences that stayed with Joseph throughout his life. Things that were ongoing, things that he found compatible with everything else that he was teaching. And just to back up a little bit, I just want to point out that, it's interesting that Joseph died not exactly penniless, but in mountains of debt, in the process of trying to start a religion and trying to avoid being arrested and going through a lot. It's hard to say whether his attempt to invoke a treasure spirit was much help to him. But, by the time his followers kicked in, Brigham Young, who succeeded him, was a millionaire by the time he died. And things have only gone on from there to where the religious empire that has resulted as of the beginning of this year reportedly has a nest egg exceeding $100 billion. So I'll leave it to you to whether his invocation was successful. Thank you for joining us today. Again, before you go, please consider a donation to Sekhet-Maat Oasis and to help us continue to offer these classes and events. Love is the law, love under will. Any questions?